The night the numbers turned from almost to inevitable, I was alone in the old boardroom we never renovated. Plaster hairline cracks, a humming exit sign, the faint citrus of the cleaning spray that always lingered after midnight. On the table, a laptop with the S1 draft, a lukewarm paper cup of drip coffee, and a note I didn't expect to find under my keyboard, written in blue ink I knew too well. Remember the lemon tree. For a second I thought it was a prank. Everyone had gone home hours ago. The motion sensor lights in the hallway kept breathing on and off. I held the paper to the light and felt my chest tighten the way it used to before a swim meet, that nervous electricity behind the ribs. The cursor blinked over the button that would send the file to our lawyers and then, within hours, to the SEC. "You good?" came a text from Owen Price, who'd been my co-founder since the months we called our company a project. I typed back, almost. My finger hovered, then I set the phone down. I could hear the chiller on the roof cutting in and out. 3 seconds of white noise, 3 seconds of quiet, over and over like a metronome. I read the note again, and the room seemed to tilt a degree, like a ship finding a wave. I hadn't thought about that tree in years. I grew up in Martinsburg, Ohio, a town whose welcome sign had stubborn optimism and chipped paint. We had a diner with 12 stools, a high school field that kept its lights on longer than it should, and winters that sniffed out any hole in your gloves. My dad, Tom Whitaker, drove a forklift until the plant closed and then did whatever was steady enough to bring home cash. Sheet metal in summer, snow plowing in winter, a week of roofing when his back was good. My mom, Linda, was a night nurse, quick with jokes that sounded like they had disclaimers. The first job I ever had was not a job. Not really. I refilled the vending machine at the volunteer fire station, and when the machine miscounted $1, it sounded like a tiny lamppost being hit by a bicycle. The smell in that room, Coke syrup, hot dust, comes back at the strangest times. The lemon tree belonged to our neighbor, Mrs. Ellison, who'd been a middle school science teacher back when teachers fixed bikes and taught kids how to solder after school. She kept the tree inside a cracked glass sunroom, its trunk wrapped with a strip of aluminum flashing to catch the heat from a small electric heater. Ohio lemons were an eccentricity and an act of defiance. In January, you could step in there and inhale a scent that was not winter, not Ohio, something that picked you up by the collar and said, "The world is larger than your street." When I was 12, I found a beige tower PC by the curb on trash day, still warm from a house that was better insulated than ours. I pushed it home on a skateboard and took it apart on the kitchen floor, while my mother stirred chili and pretended she didn't see the screws migrating toward the dog bowl. I learned that dust is a historian. Drag your finger along a heat sink, and you can tell how long it's been since anyone cared. The librarian at our branch, Mr. Hudson, saw me printing out a how-to on floppy disks and said, "Make it quick, Daniel. 30-minute limit." I nodded, because rules were part of the charm. I watched him rubber stamp returns, a little half-smile like a secret handshake with himself. The only thing wilder than the internet was seeing my father squint at an invoice and admit he didn't understand why the price of bolts had changed on a Tuesday. The first money I made on my own terms came from a lemonade stand I set up at the end of our street the one July the whole town decided to be hot in unison. I put a pinch of smoked paprika in the syrup because I'd read that a little smoke can make sweetness taste deeper. Factoid number 1 I learned from Mrs. Ellison while she pruned plants like a surgeon. "What's this?" a man in a green polo asked, fanning himself with a newspaper. "Not your average yellow." I shrugged and said, 75 cents. He took a sip and said, "Kid, you're weird." He came back the next day with a friend. By the time I was 19, I was a student at community college by day and a night tech at a data center off the highway by night, the kind of windowless building that makes its own weather. My job was to walk the aisles and listen for unusual fans, like a doctor checking heartbeats. That was where I learned the first metric I ever loved. PUE, power usage effectiveness, the ratio of total facility energy to the energy used by the IT equipment. A good number meant we weren't wasting our effort on heat. The way a system drinks electricity, the way it sighs, it's a sound you can feel in your teeth at 3 a.m. I made friends with a woman named Jessie Park, who had a pen habit and an engineer's resting skepticism. We spent breaks sitting on the loading dock reading old white papers about containerization because the way software moved between machines felt like magic performed by practical people. In those months, I realized that moving digital things efficiently has a smell too. Ozone, cardboard, coffee, and the faint, even musk of server fans. My first project was more a dare than a business. A little board that taught a school's HVAC system when to rest. I used an off-the-shelf microcontroller and a cheap light sensor to predict occupancy. I sold the idea to Mr. Redding, the janitor who ran the place like a captain. If it doesn't burn the building down and my electric bill looks less like a Christmas parade, I'll tell the superintendent, he said. 2 months later, he handed me a check for $500 and a look that said, "Don't blow this." I didn't. That year, the school's bill dropped 7%. I walked around for a week like a balloon on a leash. What came after didn't feel inevitable. It felt like finding the edge of a map. Owen, who had broken his collarbone twice in high school football and never learned to dislike risk, met me in the campus cafeteria where the vinyl seats always squeaked. He set down a tray with 3 chocolate milks and said, "We should do the real thing." We called it fairy because we liked the image of moving something without anyone noticing the motion. The thesis was simple: small buildings, small utilities, smart timing. Use wireless sensors to measure and nudge, milliwatt by milliwatt. We leaned into unsexy corners, municipal pools, strip malls where nail salons weathered recessions better than restaurants. We needed capital. A fund called Riverside Ventures agreed to $25,000 if we could get 10 buildings live in 60 days. Tessa Bloom, who ran the fund out of an office over a bodega, shook my hand and said, "We don't win if you don't win. Don't build a religion. Build a service." She smelled like tobacco gum and bergamot tea. We hired our first designer, a woman named Nina Alvarez, who had a portfolio full of door handles and light switches. She could look at a wall and see how a room wanted to be used. During our first site visit, she tapped a conduit with her knuckle, listened like a piano tuner, and said, "This building's tired. Build the interface for someone who is tired." I liked her immediately in the way you like someone who shows up with a tool belt and a book. We spent late nights in the office arguing about fonts and default choices while a broken AC coughed us all into sweaters in August. "Make it invisible," she'd say, drawing rectangles with her pen. "Make it so no one says thank you, and we take that as a compliment." Our first mistake was thinking hardware would behave as politely at scale as it did in a demo. We ordered 2,000 sensors from a factory 3 time zones and 1 galaxy away. They arrived with the frequency mislabeled, which meant they spoke like tourists on the wrong band. We found out after the second truck rolled away. "Can you fix it?" Owen asked the rep. "We can replace," came the answer, a smile you can hear over the phone. 6 weeks. In that time, a container ship got stuck sideways in an Asian port, and we learned a fact I'd never forget. A big carrier can haul over 20,000 TUs, 20-foot equivalent units, tiny rectangles that control the fates of towns. I watched the live ship tracker at 2 in the morning like it was a weather map for my life. We lost 3 contracts that month and a CFO we'd hired too early. I sat in the break room staring at a diagram of our network and felt the kind of panic that makes your jaw feel hollow. "Hey," Nina said, leaning in the doorway. "Eat something." I shook my head. "I'm not hungry." She slid half a granola bar onto the table and said, "You don't have to be hungry to eat." That sentence carried me further than the bar did. I made a call I'm not proud of, a bridge loan from a lender whose letterhead had too many metallic fonts. It kept us alive and hung a weight around our ankles. We started doing nights and weekends for a chain of gyms whose owner, a fast talker named Trevor, paid us in 50% deposit and motivational quotes. On a Sunday morning that smelled like rubber mats and laundry detergent, Nina looked up from a thermostat housing and said, "Why are we solving their problem instead of ours?" She wasn't wrong. We were treating symptoms because symptoms paid cash. The turn came from a surprise. A small utility in Texas called Seabrook Electric asked whether we could help them avoid a summer peak. "You don't have that many customers," I said on the call. "Exactly," said a woman named Melissa Carter. "Which is why we need them to act like a chorus." "You're a conductor, right?" I wanted to say no, we're barely a band, but I heard something in her voice that sounded like math with a personality. We built a test, 15 buildings, 1,000 thermostats, and a set of incentives that would make sense to an owner who thinks in monthly bills and not in shaving megawatts. It worked. On a day when the grid was a drumhead, our sites took a collective breath instead of a gasp. I stood in the parking lot of a dentist's office and watched the demand curve wobble on a rented tablet. It felt like tugging on a thread and having the whole sweater relax. We pivoted, or if you hate that word, we listened and moved our feet. We wrote orchestration software for distributed loads and stopped pretending we were a hardware company. We kept the sensors we needed and partnered for the rest. We hired a lawyer named Sophie Garrett who wore her hair in a bun so tight you knew she meant it. She cleaned our cap table like a trauma room. "You can't keep that debt," she said. "You'll never sleep." So we didn't. We didn't keep it. Sleep took longer. Somewhere in that blur, I saw a girl at a coffee shop I'd later think about when the lights were off and the AC ticked as it cooled. Emily Rhodes. She wore a gray hoodie and laughed quietly while reading a paperback with a creased spine. I asked what it was. "Dog-eared Lives," she said, showing me the cover. "Short stories." We talked for 10 minutes. She said, "I like your idea," when I told her what we did. We didn't exchange numbers. I ran into her again 6 months later at a data conference where people wore badges like they were passports. "You again," she said, smiling. We dated in the spaces between travel and triage. Sometimes we ate breakfast at 2 in the afternoon. Sometimes we slept with our phones face down on the floor like that could ether the urgency. When we broke up, no fight, just two orbits diverging. I felt the loss in the small daily ways. Reaching for someone in a grocery aisle and remembering they weren't there. Hearing a song and knowing there would be no one to say, "This part is you." By the time we stopped being a secret, the market had changed. The price of borrowed money mattered again in boardrooms that had forgotten it could. Our competitors, who had once stapled sensors to anything that stood still, were suddenly talking about efficiency and resilience. We raised a round from a firm named Barrow and Finch, whose partners wore dark denim like it was a thesis. They convinced a utility consortium to try a new kind of contract, pay us for avoiding the need to build another peaker plant. The fact that made the pitch land wasn't even ours. It belonged to physics and weather. In certain regions, especially where wind is strong, nighttime electricity prices can go negative when supply outpaces demand. "We can surf the dips," Owen said, tracing curves on a whiteboard, "and flatten the spikes." That line ended up in a prospectus a year later. Not all our meetings were wins. A distributor in the Midwest took me to lunch and said, "You're city boys. Our guys don't want an app. They want the number on the bill lower." He wasn't wrong. We changed our demo to start with the bill and backed into the tech later. Nina, who could be impatient with sales, rolled her eyes and then, in front of the customer, adjusted our dashboard to make the savings number 3 times larger. "Kidding," she said. He didn't laugh. She pushed the number back to the honest one. "We're serious," she said. "We're also human." I kept thinking about that lemon tree. In winter, Mrs. Ellison would wheel it to the center of the sunroom and wrap the pot with a moving blanket. "Microclimate," she told me once. "Don't ask the whole room to be warm. Make a pocket." That is what our company did for the grid, I realized years later. We built pockets of intelligence inside a system built to be dumb and safe. When she passed away, I was in an airport. I walked into one of those shops that sells glossy magazines and neck pillows and stood between a rack of phone chargers and a wall of sunglasses. I sent a donation to the school science program in her name and bought a lemon from a grocery store that evening, put it on my windowsill, and watched it do nothing. You can't grow a tree by staring, but you can remember. There are 2 kinds of hard in a company, and no one prepares you for the whiplash between them. There's hard like math. Figure out the model, listen to the data, don't let your biases run the meeting. And there's hard like people, a teammate whose mother is sick, an engineer who drinks too much in silence, a product manager who smiles wide, and then goes home and stares at the ceiling. The day we had to lay off 7 people, I put my phone in a drawer and walked around the block until my feet hurt. A kid on a scooter almost clipped me and said, "Sorry," and then, softer, "My bad," as if he were practicing being a person. Later, in the quiet office, Owen said, "You did the right thing." I nodded. Then, "I hate that the right thing hurt." Somewhere in the slope-up months, a journalist named Maya Trent wrote a profile that was half love letter, half cross-examination. She visited our customers and stood in server rooms long enough to get that ozone smell in her hair. "What keeps you up?" she asked me while we sat on milk crates outside the south substation of a city that never thinks about substations. The possibility that we're building a lever big enough to move something important, I said, and I'm not holding it right. In print it sounded braver. She asked about the women in my life, and I spoke carefully because I didn't want anyone to be a plot device. I mentioned Emily, whose texts I still didn't look at after midnight, and Nina, who had become a friend I trusted like a level. I did not mention a brief, bright thing with a venture associate named Lila who wore boots that made doorways look smaller and who could read a term sheet like a weather map. It didn't last and didn't have to. We grew, which means our mistakes got bigger too. We bet on a communications protocol that lost a standards fight by 2 votes in a room we weren't allowed into. We shipped a build that throttled demand so aggressively it triggered alarms in a hospital's BAS, and I sat in the parking lot as the facility's director yelled at me with the particular fury reserved for people who keep patients alive. "You can't do that," he said, more exhausted than angry now. "You can't guess." We didn't sleep for 2 days, then changed our safety margins and hired someone who'd run a hospital boiler room for 20 years to sit at our table and tell us what mattered when the pie charts didn't. On a different night, in a different boardroom, we pitched the long version, not just thermostats and time-of-use rates, but choreography across EV fast chargers that could gulp 350 kilowatts per stall, enough to light dozens of homes briefly, and battery arrays that we'd teach to be generous at the right hour and selfish when everyone else was asleep. We knew that if we didn't learn to talk about cars, we'd be eaten by companies that did. I had to explain to a mayor with a good haircut why curtailing a 50-stall charging plaza by 10% during a 10-minute window could keep a neighborhood substation from tripping on a July afternoon. He looked at me like I was trying to sell him a bridge. Nina slid her phone across the table with a simulation she built the way I used to build model rockets. "It's a dimmer, not a switch," she said. "You won't notice. Your residents won't notice. But your utility will." Our fact list grew the way fact lists do when you're paying attention. I learned that walls with a pinkish hue reflect a fraction more light than you think when painted eggshell. That some wind farms produce so much power at 2 in the morning the market pays you to take it. That the first successful undersea telegraph cable carried a message that took 17 hours to cross the Atlantic and made people weep because the world had shrunk. I learned that most small commercial buildings don't have as-built anyone trusts. Only paper with pencil scars and coffee rings. And this small one, a certain model of occupancy sensor clicks faintly in a quiet room, a sound that can feel like companionship or intrusion depending on who you are and how your day went. When the first acquisition offers came, they arrived like holiday cards from unfamiliar cousins. Big logos, ceremonial language. We said no to all of them with the bravado of people who had just enough money in the bank to forget hunger. Then we said maybe to one because the synergies actually made sense, and then we said no again when they insisted on renaming us with a compound noun that sounded like a toothpaste. The IPO talk started as a joke. "Imagine us on one of those lists," Owen said, stirring the office coffee with a plastic knife because the spoons had lost a war. But it kept coming up. Going public was not a finish line. It was a widening of the road, the addition of lanes in both directions. You can speed up or crash with more style. The night before we filed, I couldn't sleep, so I went to the office because that's where my body went when my brain was crowded. I walked past the line of plants by the window, Nina's idea to make us less fluorescent, and stopped at the small lemon tree someone had bought me as a joke years ago. It had 4 glossy leaves and exactly 1 lemon hanging like a badge. I touched the skin with a finger and felt the waxiness, the little dimples, a coolness that did not match the room. That's when I found the note. "Remember the lemon tree." I thought it was from Nina, but the handwriting was older. My mother, years back, had written those words on a recipe card and stuck it in a box she sent when we moved offices, a casserole dish, an oven mitt, measuring cups. I'd tossed the card in a drawer and forgotten it. Someone must have found it when we were cleaning. The note meant, build warmth around the things you want to keep alive. Don't heat the whole warehouse. I texted my mom a selfie with the plant. She wrote back, "Don't forget to eat." Then, "You always pretended you weren't hungry." At 1:11 a.m. An hour I've always liked for its visual tidiness. I opened the document and scrolled the parts that our lawyers had stretched like taffy. Risks, definitions, the place where we had to say we weren't promising anything. I thought about the kid in me who learned what PUE was because it felt like a superpower to know when a system was efficient. I thought about Jessie tapping her pen on the loading dock, about Tessa's bergamot, about Melissa from Seabrook saying we could be a conductor, about Sophie's bun, about Maya's recorder, about Emily's quiet laugh when a story ended in an unexpected place, about my father's hands, rough as a cutting board, teaching me how to check the oil by smell. I thought about Mrs. Ellison wheeling that tree a little to the left, just so, to catch the angle of winter sun that came through a seam in the glass. That image steadied me like a hand on the shoulder. I hit send. The weeks that followed were a machine. Bankers with flawless hair and a new flavor of courtesy. Long calls where you have to be interesting but not reckless, clear but not promotional. I took a pre-roadshow meeting in a conference room whose windows overlooked a water tower painted to look like a peach, and for a second I thought of paprika and laughed out loud. The associate across the table tilted her head. I said, "Long story." She said, "You'll tell it when it's the right time." We priced within the little range they draw like a tiny fence on a graph, which people pretended meant destiny. The bell day was a blur. My mom stood next to me wearing the same jacket she wore to my high school graduation, and my dad wore a tie that made him look like he was doing an impression of himself going to church. "Proud of you," he said, hugging me with one arm and keeping the other in his pocket like he was afraid to break something expensive. I looked down at the hand I used to push a skateboard with and thought, not of the billions that would be in articles the next day, but of how the server room felt at 3 a.m., humming, steady, doing what it was built to do. A funny thing about numbers when you cross one threshold, they feel both larger and less real. I could afford to buy the diner in my hometown and pay the cooks what they'd always deserved. I did. We took down the sign with the warped E in breakfast and found the original lettering underneath. I set aside money for the library that had fed me when I was starving for something I couldn't name. Mr. Hudson had retired, but he came to the ceremony with a stack of old plastic cards and stamped the air like he was blessing us. The night after, I walked outside and listened to crickets that didn't care who I was. There were costs, and they weren't unusual, but they were mine. I learned my face looks tired in fluorescent light and youthful in kindness. I learned that lawsuits feel like an iron smell you can't wash off, and that winning one is not the same as being right, not in the places where it matters. I learned that I could sit on my couch for an entire Sunday and feel both grateful and vaguely ill, like I cheated a system I also helped repair. And I learned that money is a megaphone, not a song, and you have to be careful what you amplify. Sometimes when I travel, I bring a tiny bottle of lemon oil and put a drop on my wrist in the hotel room, just enough to remind me of that Ohio sunroom. I keep a photograph of Emily and me in a plastic sleeve in a book on my shelf. We text on birthdays and the dates that aren't holidays. She has a kid now who likes dinosaurs. Nina runs design at a place that makes humanitarian hardware. Her office has more sunlight than ours ever did. Owen bought a motorcycle and rides in a way that makes me switch off my phone until he texts that he's back, which is his way of saying he knows I worry. My mother sends me recipes for soups you can start at 10 and eat at 6. My father still asks if I check the oil. A few months ago, I took the lemon tree home for a while because the heat in the office hissed like it had a secret. I set it by my window and watched a single leaf turn a brighter green after a day of thin winter sun. I thought about microclimates again, about how you can build warmth without lighting a bonfire. That same week, a small utility commissioner in a dusty county called and said, "I don't want a big solution. I want a quiet one." I said, "That's our favorite kind." We flew out and stood in the substation and listened. The air crackled, a felt sound. "Hear that?" I asked the intern we'd brought, a kid named Ben with a baseball cap and a habit of apologizing for having ideas. He nodded. "It sounds alive." "It is," I said. "We just have to help it breathe without anyone noticing." The note from that night sits on my desk now, under a coaster. It's creased in a way that suggests it's been folded and unfolded by someone thinking hard. I trace the letters when I'm on hold. I don't know who found it and put it beneath my keyboard. Maybe Sophie, who has a nose for narrative. Maybe Nina, or maybe the cleaning guy who hums under his breath and has watched us all learn to pretend we don't cry sometimes at work. It doesn't matter. The instruction is the same. Surround what matters with just enough care. Be deliberate with heat. I took a walk tonight after finishing this. The city was soft with late light, the way the skyline turns into a strip of paper cutouts at dusk. I passed a corner store where the bell on the door makes a noise like a dropped spoon. A woman paid with exact change and smiled at the cashier like they'd spent their whole lives getting to this transaction. I bought a lemon I didn't need and carried it in my palm. It was cool at first, then warm from my skin. On the way home, a kid on a scooter almost clipped me again. Different kid, same age, same sorry. I stepped aside and thought of the data center aisle, of humming machines and the comfort of rules, and of a tree that shouldn't have grown where it did and did anyway, because someone decided it could. Tomorrow I'll wake up and there will be a message from a city I've never been to that wants to try making their grid breathe a little easier. I'll say yes and ask how their winters smell, how their August sounds at 3 in the afternoon. If I'm lucky, I'll sit in a quietly loud room with people who disagree with me in a way that feels like collaboration. We will argue about defaults, and we will decide together where to put the heat. On my way out, I'll check the leaves of a plant I don't know the name of, press a finger into the soil, and feel whether it needs water. Not everything that grows needs a speech. Some things just need a hand to move them 2 inches closer to the light.